Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. This is the podcast where we explore the evolving maritime landscape and hear from the innovators leading the charge. Today's guest is Tom Lister, CEO of Global Ship Lease, a New York Stock Exchange-listed container ship owner. Under Tom's leadership, GSL has built a reputation for extending the value and operational life of container ships while navigating an evolving technological and regulatory landscape. We're going to talk about all those things today with Tom. And Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris, and thank you very much for having me on.
You know, this is really exciting, and I want to give everybody a little bit of a primer. And if you listened to the podcast before, maybe you've heard this, but maybe not, because we have a lot of new folks who listen to the podcast, new to the industry. So love to hear about what you're doing and how you're doing it, but also talk a little bit about, as you kind of get into more of what the company is doing, the difference between an owner operator and a pure owner, which is kind of where you are. And I think people talk owner operator in the same sentence, and I think there's a little bit of a difference. So as we get into that, talk about what you're doing and talk about how, own ships and how that's different.
Sure. Okay. I mean, you've hit upon the sort of the core question at the heart of our business. So if I were to use an analogy, our customers, the shipping lines, are very much like airlines. They organize the movement of freight, and they have complex networks, and they're actually moving the cargo all over the world. And where we fit into the picture, GSL, is as an owner and provider of ships, of tonnage to those shipping lines. So we own the ships, we crew the ships, and then we lease out or time charter out those ships to the airlines. And broadly, not to the airlines, to the shipping lines. And broadly speaking, the shipping lines, I took the analogy too far. Broadly speaking, the shipping lines tend to own roughly 50 to 60% of the capacity that they operate all over the world. And they tend to lease in or charter in between 40 and 50%. So we're providing part of that 40 to 50% of capacity that they charter in.
Yeah, so that's a big difference. And I wanted to jump into that because if you're new to the industry, and Tom, we talked a little bit before, one of our target audience, and I've gotten a lot of support, are people who come in new into the industry. And what attracted you to GSL? Because New York Stock Exchange listed company, which is awesome. What attracted you to working for this type of business model?
I mean, if I scroll back to the very beginning of the story, I have to confess, Chris, I fell into the industry. I came to it really quite by chance. So I left university in the UK a third of a century ago, staggeringly, and I managed to get on a container ship and did a working passage on that container ship from Liverpool in the north of England, around northern Europe, across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal, and then down to the southern tip of South America, Chile, where I got off. And when I arrived in Chile, I went and knocked on the door of Hamburg Süd, which was one of the big shipping lines of the time. They've since been absorbed by Maersk, and essentially asked them to give me a job on spec, which they did. So that's how I fell into the industry. I then sort of stayed within the liner shipping side of it for about 10 years, moving around the world. And then from there, I went and did an MBA at INSEAD in France. And when I came out of there, I realized that shipping continued to fascinate me. But I changed gears a little bit and went into the ship owning and asset finance side of things. From there into banking, and from there into Global Ship Lease. And at that stage, Global Ship Lease was a spin-off from CMA CGM, which is the third largest liner shipping company in the world. And they wanted to spin off a small sub-fleet of assets. I think it was 17 or 19 ships at the time, something like that. And they wanted us to be the vehicle to do it. So we took the company public in New York in August of 2008, so a matter of weeks before Lehman Brothers went bust. So it was a fairly white-knuckle ride from the outset. We managed to take the company public just by the skin of our teeth, and then ran it through probably the worst decade the industry has ever seen, which brought with it lots of challenges, interesting challenges, but challenges nevertheless. And then in November of 2018, we merged with Poseidon Containers, which was a fleet of container ships that had been built up by George Eurukos, who's our chairman today, with the backing of a US private equity company. And they wanted to exit their investment, and they couldn't sell the ships piecemeal, they thought, effectively. So they looked to merge into GSL as a publicly listed company. and then sell down their exposure through the public markets, which is what they effectively did. So that brings us more or less to where we are today. So we're the sort of the product of a challenging IPO, an extremely successful merger, and then organic growth. And today we've got a fleet of 69 container ships, which makes us, I think, the 7th largest in the world by number of ships, either the 5th or 7th, in terms of tonnage providers. And yes, we're running a business which is going well.
Man, what a great and interesting story. Certainly, I was involved with a company that was an owner operator, and a little bit later in the cycle after Lehman and everything else, but certainly owned by private equity, and they wanted to unwind it, and they ended up selling the fleet to TK, just lock, stock, and barrel, rather than trying to sell onesie twosies, realizing that they couldn't do that, and they ended up saying, "Here's the fleet." TK took it, and that was Prince Amar. That was a vehicle owned by Apollo at the time.
Incredible, yeah, a lot of parallels there.
So a lot of parallels and really interesting. And I know for some of the diehard folks who listen to this for digitalization, we're gonna get to that in a second. But it just goes to show a few things. One is that the industry, in terms of the asset side, is super complex, and there's lots of ways to be a part of the industry, certainly. And not everybody gets in the same way. My industry background of getting into it was, I went to one of the maritime schools. Nobody in my family was in maritime. I'm like, wow, this looks kind of cool. I get to travel. I get to do international business maybe or not. And I ended up here now hosting a podcast, which wasn't on the radar even 10 years ago. But
yeah, but that's the wonderful thing about it, Chris. I do think this industry has the ability to stay endlessly fascinating. And as you were saying earlier, there are so many different facets in which people can become involved, including, as you say, podcasts.
Exactly. Or hopping a ship and sliding down from Liverpool down to Chile and knocking on a door. What a fantastic thing. And the reason why I wanted to kind of explain the relationship and the difference between, owner operator, and then pure owners, which is where you guys fit in, and then leasing the ship out. And I really appreciate the airline analogy, because I think most people, that makes a lot of sense, rather than trying to figure out other ways, which means you have to collaborate a lot with the people you lease the ships to. And that's an important part of that. Given what's going on in technology, whether it's fuel efficiencies or digitalization, can you talk about how you guys approach that, and with balancing kind of cost as well as needs? And you alluded to geopolitical. We could get into more regulatory side. I guess geopolitical is part of it, but really the regulatory side to help your clients, the lessors. I always get that backwards, or you could correct me.
The lessees.
The lessees, yes, you're the lessors. Yeah, the lessees, to help the lessees comply and keep their fleet, at the highest standard that they want to see it at.
Again, you've put your finger on it. We're not sort of spot providers of ships, meaning we're not there to just provide ships on a short-term basis to the shipping lines, our customers. Ours is much more of a partnership approach. So we're looking to provide our charterers with the ships they need over the medium and long term. Now, obviously, what that means is that we have to be receptive to their needs as they evolve. And you pointed to the regulatory environment, and you're absolutely right. That's something which is evolving, I would say, faster in the last 3 or 4 years than in the preceding 30 years. So it's a very, very rapid state of change. And one of the principal points of focus is emissions. Decarbonization, reducing the carbon and pollution footprint of the shipping lines. And, you can do that in quite a number of ways, but the ones that we have focused upon, again, in partnership with the charterers, our customers, it effectively sits on 4 pillars. The first of which is fairly analog. So we retrofit our ships physically with enhanced propellers, eco-propellers, optimized bulbous bows, enhanced hull coatings, various ducts to ensure that the hydrodynamics of the ship, so essentially the friction of the ship as it passes through the water, is reduced as much as possible. And you can improve the efficiency and reduce the fuel burn by between 15 and 20% by doing those sorts of things. The second prong or pillar is making sure that our ships can burn low carbon biofuels, which feeds into the sort of the eco cycle of using renewable fuels, biofuels in this context. The third prong, which I guess is the principal focus of your podcast, is technology in terms of data and digitalization and capturing high frequency operating data from sensors aboard our ships in real time, and not only receiving that data ourselves, but also sharing that data with the shipping lines, our customers, in order to really support collaborative optimization of ship operations to drive out the sort of the spike and trough and spike of operating profiles, which tend to burn a lot of fuel. So those are the first three. And then there's a speculative fourth prong, which is onboard carbon capture and storage, which is proving a tough one to crack, to be perfectly honest. But if someone does manage to crack it, and we've invested actually in a carbon capture startup to try to sort of learn and drive the process. But if someone does crack it, that will be, I think, one of the genuine silver bullets to transition the industry from a hydrocarbon present to a much greener future, whether that greener future in terms of fuel is nuclear or ammonia or methanol or hydrogen or any number of the different avenues that people are exploring. The bridge to that could be carbon capture and storage.
And I want to unpack that a little bit, because what I find interesting is that you're making an investment into the space. And we've had on a few different folks on the startup side, Neil Garsman, couple of others. And the interesting thing, what we're hearing more, is companies like yours either investing through those type of vehicles, VC, or directly with the startup. Talk a little bit about that decision, because I think it's kind of interesting, because you point to two really fascinating parts. The first part is, yes, you get, you get first crack at the technology, get some feedback, but you also get to see what else is going on. And I think that that's also the important part. It almost gives you a window into things like their competition, what other ship owners or other people are doing. Maybe there's a collaborative approach with potentially even a competitor, right? If they happen to invest, and you can have a collaborative approach for the better of the industry. Unpack that a little bit, because I think that's really fascinating.
I would divide it in two, actually, Chris. So I'd put the first three pillars: physical retrofits of the ships, biofuels, and data capture, into one bucket, and then carbon capture and storage into a second bucket, at least in terms of, raising capital and strategic approach. Both, by the way, are collaborative in nature. Now, for the first bucket, we collaborate very closely with the charterers themselves, so the big lines, the likes of Maersk and CMA and MSC. Why? Because if you make a ship more efficient in order to emit less, it means you're making the ship burn less fuel. And given that the charterers are the folk who pay for the fuel, essentially you're investing in an asset in order to unlock savings for them, for the customer, for the charterer. As a result, it's possible to work collaboratively both on developing the solution and also funding that solution. So it's equitable for the lines who are enjoying the savings to also invest actively, co-invest in making the enhancements. So we're coming up with a better ship at the end of the enhancements, and they're coming up with a more efficient, lower fuel burning ship that they're using within their operating fleet. So it's very much a win-win on each of those sort of three initial pillars. Now, as far as the carbon capture and storage is concerned, you're absolutely right. One of the big motivations for us in investing in carbon capture and storage is not only because we genuinely see it as the silver bullet, as I said before, but also that we know very well that they need smart money in order to get them towards the goal. So, the company we invested in, Aqualung, they brought together as a first step, not pure capital providers, but industry players who were going to bring expertise and capital to the table in order to sort of accelerate their progress and drive traction. So I think collaboration is a theme that runs through all of this. You're absolutely right to put your finger on that.
And I really think that that's an interesting point, because if you look at where the industry is going, and not just on hardware investments like carbon capture and potentially other things. Certainly, if you look at the wind, the wind propulsion, it has gotten a lot of attention, rightfully so. It seems to be a pretty, at this point, looking from the outside, a pretty known entity, at least. Okay, we could capture X amount of fuel savings and I would imagine that there's more and more seafarers becoming acclimated with how this works, and then the do's and the don'ts and those sort of things, certainly within class and in that type of regulatory side of assuring that it doesn't interfere with the safe navigation of the ship cargo, right? So I feel that that's a good thing. But what I kind of see this as really interesting is that more and more companies, the startup side, are taking that approach of not just grabbing any money, but grabbing smart money, whether it's through some of the funds that focus primarily on shipping because they could gather that expertise, or even going right with, to folks like yourself that you wouldn't necessarily say would be startup investors, but it kind of has a different profile. You have a different profile than a startup investor. It's speculative in a way, but in a way it isn't, I feel. It's kind of like you're not just doing something that's completely out there. It's out there in our industry, I think, but not at the far reaches of space, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way of putting it. And I mean, what we're doing is we're putting comparatively small bets on the table because the industry is at an inflection point. And once again, I've been in this industry one way or another for 33 years, which is a fair amount of time, but albeit it's an industry which has been around for millennia. But nevertheless, we're seeing a big shift from what is effectively a mono-fuel environment. It's not quite true, it's heavy, it's fuel oil and it's LNG, but it's broadly speaking one or two standard forms of fuel towards a completely uncertain future when nobody really knows which is going to be the winner or which are going to be the winners in terms of future fuel. Methanol, Maersk put a big bet there. LNG, lots of people are betting on that, at least as an interim fuel. Ammonia seems to be the academic fuel of choice. And there's a growing recognition, I think, that ultimately it's probably nuclear, which is going to be the fuel of the future. But, you're going back to your question about seafarers' expertise, safety concerns, regulatory concerns, political issues. All of these are hurdles for each of the fuels that I've just mentioned, some more than others. So it's a world of uncertainty. And if you're in a world of uncertainty, our view at least is you need to maximize your optionality. What does that mean? That means having a fleet which is as flexible as possible. It means stretching the elastic on the economic life of existing ships, making them more efficient where you can, collaboratively. And it means not placing a big single bet on the table, particularly, and this comes back to the point you were making at the very beginning, Chris, because we're tonnage providers. We're not the dog, we're the tail on the dog. Ultimately, we're going to be wagged by our charterers who are going to guide us on what we need to provide them over the longer term when you start taking a 30-year view on a new ship. So maximum optionality, not too many big bets on the table, but lots of small bets, and doing our best to learn from others. We think being a smart follower, a smart and nimble follower, is probably the right approach to take at this particular point in time. So that's sort of where we are.
You don't have to be the first mover, right, in this sort of thing. As a matter of fact, you could let the other, like I think you mentioned, the big bet that Maersk is making on that. So let them do that, right? And if it proves to be the right thing, then you just go into their wake and that's the end of that. And if they pivot a little bit to something else, then you could just pivot right into there. Because ultimately, those are the types of folks who are your clients, and you want to be reactive to your clients. That's kind of the
100%.
The backbone of any business, whether it's a fishmonger. And I think about that because that's what my grandfather was. And I remember him telling me a story about knowing what the clients want and then saying, this is how you prepare the fish. And these were people, it was actually, I'm going to go on a tangent, at a place called Cidarella's. And if anybody's in New York City, Cidarella's started off as a storefront. It's a restaurant as well as a fish store, all within New York City, but it started off as a storefront. My grandfather worked there. But one of the things that he taught me, and when just not teaching, but just listening, is that you kind of want to give what the clients want. You got to listen
exactly,
and then give what the clients. So it doesn't matter where you are in that profile. That's the number one job. Pivoting a little bit to the digital side, or at least the data side, some of the things about getting data off the ship. I had somebody on about a year ago who said about 90% of the data, and he was referring to cruise ships, is left on the ship, meaning they don't have that kind of visibility into the day-to-day what's going on. In your opinion, how are you tackling that? How are you overcoming that? Because really all the changes that the companies that you work with are going to make, they have to be measured, right? In order for them to get a better day charter rate or to comply with whatever regulation it is, they have to get that data off. How are you guys helping them and working on that approach and some of the challenges there?
Sure. So first of all, we've installed our entire fleet with IoT sensors to capture operating data in real time and on a high frequency basis. And we've had to install huge pipelines of bandwidth to effectively suck that data from the vessels into the cloud, where we can analyze it and where the technology providers we're working with can help us analyze it, and also crucially to share it with the lines themselves so that they can analyze it. So that's the first step, and we've got our entire fleet wired for this high frequency data. And the second step, although again this is a little bit speculative, is to see what we can do with machine learning and artificial intelligence to unlock additional value from that data going forward. And the truth is, none of us really know where this is going to lead. But if you don't have the data itself, you don't have the options. If you do have the data, you have the option to apply technology to that data as that technology and thinking evolves over time. So I think we're just at the very beginning of this process, Chris. I think there's a hell of a lot of value and efficiency to be gained from the data, and a lot of it we're not even aware of yet.
Yeah, I tend to agree on that. I think that that's one of the areas that you could look to almost not necessarily future proof, but be forward looking on that you have the data, you unlock that. And now it's like, okay, what do I do with all this? And I'm sure that there's a lot of ways to start to thinking about it. And I would imagine, did a lot of your kind of increase in the pipeline, did that come from changing your communication to Starlink and things like that? Is that something that you looked into as well, the ships? Because that seems to be a big step change for a lot of ship owners. I had a ship owner friend of mine, even on the Great Lakes, he put in Starlink. And this is more of a closed ecosystem in terms of where his ships go. But he said he put it on and it changed the way that even they do business. And I say even way because they have ships that run for 70 years. So it's a very, talk about like, definitely an older way of looking at it because it's all freshwater. They all come out of the water every year. It's a different dynamics. Pivoting away from that in a second, just the pipeline of information has changed because you have a bigger pipeline. And is that just Starlink or are there other things that you're kind of utilizing?
Starlink is certainly a big piece of that. And I think another thing to sort of mention is that we started broadening this pipeline not just because of capturing high frequency operating data from the ships, but it also was somewhat in the wake of COVID, realizing that we had to do a lot more to look after the folk actually aboard our ships, after the seafarers who, as you'll remember, Chris, during the worst of COVID, seafarers were effectively prisoners on their ships because it was very, very difficult to find ports where they could be discharged. And, psychologically to be separated from your family for such a period of time, terrible. Now, if while being physically separated, you also have the means to talk to your family, to communicate with your family, to see your family on a screen, a bit like, we're doing now, that does a lot, I think, or we believe, to help the morale of seafarers, even in a non-pandemic environment. So expanding the bandwidth for our ships was, on the one hand, yes, it's facilitated operating data. On the other hand, crucially, and I really do think this is important, it has allowed us to support the crew, both in terms of contact with family and training and support in ways that were much more difficult before. So it's a sort of twin benefit.
And that's a big part of the communication improvement, right? And I've talked not only to ship owners, operators, but also to a lot of mental health experts, as well as seafarer chaplains who say that this is one of the biggest kind of positives that have come out of COVID and Starlink is the fact that you can have this link. And I want to ask, one of the biggest challenges, and maybe I'll ask it this way, is there something that in the next 3 to 5 years that we're not paying attention to that as a CEO, you need to pay attention to now? And I'm going to pre-bake it seafarer and seafarer availability has to be one of them, because if you look at it, we are projected to have a shortage, not only globally, but, going to wave the flag sitting here in the U.S., U.S. mariners. Is that one of the things that you kind of start to worry about as you start to look towards that 3 to 5 year window, not 6 to 6 months to a year? You can kind of wrap your arms around it, but when you're really kind of brainstorming on what the next problems are, can you give us a little bit of outline of what your thinking is, as well as what do seafarers and that shortage kind of pop up on what your radar is there?
Yeah, look, I mean, if you were to sort of come up with a list of the various challenges that are facing the industry, and as a result, companies within the industry, the uniting factor across all of them, or the uniting factor in terms of finding a solution for all of them, tends to be finding and keeping seafarers and quality seafarers and looking after those seafarers. So I think, in a way, this conversation has brought us to that conclusion pretty naturally, Chris. So yes, seafarer welfare and retention has to be, I think, probably in the top 3 of things that ship owners have to think about and have to solve.
Yeah. Anything else kind of on that radar that you're thinking about that maybe the industry isn't paying enough attention to, that you go, boy, we got to think about this as well?
Well, I mean, we've talked about the energy transition, at some length already. Clearly, that's occupying a lot of people's brain space, and quite rightly so. And I've tried to describe how at least we're addressing that. And then, of course, you've got this massive economic experiment that's going on, being driven by the US at the moment, which, if successful, is likely to breed replication in terms of increasing protectionism, increasing nationalism, increasing regionalization. So that's a big issue for the industry to grapple with too. It sort of sits at the intersection of the macroeconomic and the geopolitical. And that's actually even before we talk about the fact that the world is having to grapple with hot wars at the same time as trade wars at the moment. All of these things are things that the industry has to deal with. But as we said at the outset, shipping's been around for millennia, and it has coped with all sorts of challenges over that time. It is fundamentally adaptable, and it will reshape itself to whatever the future needs. And I think, that's another part of our optionality story, having mid-size and smaller container ships, which we have, which are not captive to any particular trade lane, and are pieces that can be moved around the chessboard by the lines as the different macro trends change, is a big plus. So, disruption tends to play to our global ship leases advantage. At least that's how we see it. Touching wood.
For those that don't know, you have kind of the big, generally, and again, I come from the tanker side, so correct me, feel free. But generally, you have the bigger ships that go into the large deep water ports, Rotterdam, Long Beach, New York, Houston starting to creep up there. Obviously, Shanghai and Singapore and these other places. And then the smaller ships where your ship come in and they feed out to the ports, to the smaller ports. So these bigger ships could just do fewer calls with lots more container moves, and you guys come in and get it to closer to the consumer, I think, is probably the best way, or closer to the manufacturing port to get it to the big ports. Yeah. Basically, the hub and spoke method. If you go back to that
the airline analogy, yes, that's right.
Airlines, it's hub and spoke, really simple. But what you're saying is the smaller ships now have this flexibility because of not being tied to certain ports or really draft restricted on certain ports. You guys have some more flexibility, which kind of plays into what you just talked about.
100%. And, just to throw some data at that, Chris, if you look at the big east-west arterial trades, China, Europe, or the Trans-Pacific, so China into the US, collectively, they represent roughly a quarter of global containerized trade volumes, which means that roughly 3/4 of global containerized trade volumes sit outside those big east-west trades, which means intra-Asia, which means Latin America, which means the Africa trades, the Australasia trades, etc. And it's in those non-mainland trades that the mid-size and smaller ships that we use, so our fleet ranges in size from roughly 2,000 containers, 2,000 TEU at the bottom, to roughly 10 or 11,000 TEU at the top end, and they can be traded pretty much anywhere. And that's a huge advantage. And you're right, the sort of the A380 equivalent, again, beating the airline analogy to death.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
The really big ships tend to be captive in a way to those big east-west arterial trades.
And they're built almost in a way, and I kind of equate that almost to VLCCs, LNGs, Capes. They're built to purpose, right? Cape-sized ships are not, coming into a mid-sized port in the Mediterranean. It's not happening, right? Now you could have a feeder ship, with coal or iron ore. Sure, why not? If you have something special, but generally, no, that's built for purpose. It's great. I really appreciate you coming on, being a CEO, publicly listed company. What in your role kind of keeps you up at night these days? You've touched upon a few things: hot wars, not cold wars. the regulatory issues, and even assuring that seafarers kind of, yes, do their job, but then do it in a way that's equitable and those sort of things, in terms of, because
they
doing
want to
the
come
right
back
thing there.
On our ships.
Yeah, you want them to come back. But what is keeping you up at night, and kind of how are you approaching it, and how are you dealing with it on a day-to-day?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say, this, at the risk of sounding a bit glib, which it's not intended to sound, but I would say that at the company level, we are, once again, touching wood, in a good place. So we've got a lot of flexibility in our fleet. It can be deployed anywhere. We have a very strong set of counterparties, charterers, all of which who have very, very strong balance sheets. We've got good forward charter cover. So we've got, over 2 years worth of average forward cover, which means we've got very good forward visibility on cash flows. We've delevered. So, our financial leverage is less than 1 times. So in every single respect, we are well positioned to deal with a lot of uncertainty. And there is a lot of uncertainty around at the moment.
Right.
And the Greeks, who, as you know, Chris, have managed to make terrific sums of money out of shipping for generations. And their maxim has been, be patient, be disciplined, and be nimble. And, those are the sort of watchwords that guide us. So what keeps me awake? It's actually more as a parent that I'm awake at night, wondering what the world holds in store for my 2 boys, who are now 15 and 18. That's what keeps me awake at night. It's not really the business itself, I have to confess.
Interesting. Yeah, I have the same. Type of thinking there with 3, 21, 17, and 13. Certainly, it's in the same wheelhouse of thinking about kind of a little bit of their future and what they're facing, for sure. And I'm sure it resonates with anybody who's a parent or a guardian or even aunt or uncle or what have you. On to something I love to finish off with as a CEO and C-suite. I'm sure you're traveling a bunch. I'm sure you have to read a lot of it. Reports for investors, reports from people you're looking at investing in, and all that good stuff. But what are you reading these days? And by the way, you can answer this by saying, I'm writing something. I've had a few authors on the podcast. Kind of interesting. Okay, that's kind of cool. I've had, and not just like maritime stuff. I have somebody, Chris Watson, who's like an author about I think detective novels. Okay, that's really cool. And that's his hobby. Or I shouldn't say hobby. Maybe it's going to be his retirement. I don't know. But we have a lot of people there. What are you reading? What do you throw in the bag or on a Kindle or listen to or what have you?
Well, you've really intimidated me with that preamble.
Don't be intimidated, please.
So I'm not writing anything. I'm now feeling deeply ashamed of myself.
Oh, please don't. There's very few.
So you did prime me ahead of the podcast to expect this question. So, I've recently reread a book. There are 2 books I'm going to give you, actually. The first is shipping related, and it's one I recently reread, and it's called 90% of Everything: Inside Shipping, the Invisible Industry That Puts Clothes on Your Back, Gas in Your Car, and Food on Your Plate. And it was published about 10 years or maybe 12 years ago by Rose George. It's a really... Well, I think the title says it all, but it also takes a fairly unvarnished look at the industry and certainly identifies things that we need to think about more and do better. Seafarer welfare being one of them, incidentally. And then there's a work of fiction that I'm reading actually at the moment, which is called James by Percival Everett, and it came out last year. And I'm a big fan of Mark Twain and of Huckleberry Finn. And what this book does is take one of the characters from the adventures of Huckleberry Finn and sort of extrapolates his story. It's a great book.
That's actually kind of cool. I'm not really reading anything right now. Speaking of futures, I'm doing a lot of traveling to youth sports events. So my extracurricular has been a lot of driving. But Tom, this was great. Thank you for giving us a view from the top on how you view a lot of what you're dealing with, and also a view from the container industry. This is not an industry that I'm familiar. You know, I too have been in the industry for almost the same amount of time as you. And it's funny, I've spent my whole time on tankers and bulk trades. And that's it. So really to get this insight on how the container ship market looks at it, how you're working with some fabulous partners to, you know, innovate and in a lot of different ways. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Thank you so much, Tom.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.